welcome to the Therapy Corner. Here at the Therapy Corner, what we try to do is educate, enlighten, demystify all things that are psychological in nature. Counseling, therapy, research. And today, we have a special guest. As I say, they're always special because they are always special to me. And today we have April Wilson. And April Wilson is an associate clinical social worker. And she has spent the last 10 years working with children and families and adults who have complex trauma. It'll be part of what we'll be talking about today. She currently works both at a local hospital as a social worker and for the Center for Human Understanding and Growth. April, welcome. Good to have you.
Hi, Oli. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good. Now, my understanding is we're going to be talking about complex trauma, but we're going to kind of hook it in with that last presentation that was done. Deborah Bales, I always call her Bayless. Deborah Bales did this wonderful presentation on ACEs. And do you want to start there, or you start wherever you like?
Yeah, so ACEs, for those of you who didn't see the presentation, stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And basically, they are a series of questions, 10 questions, that ask about a person's childhood and the type of events that they were exposed to. There's sort of this universal idea, and often through different cultures, that we don't have trauma, or the things that we do experience we're just told to live with. And the goal of ACEs is to establish that we do experience trauma, how they impact our life and our choices that we make through childhood into adulthood and through the remainder of our lives, how we interact with others, as well as how it overall impacts our physical, mental health, and our public health as a community.
Oh, I'm glad you brought in the community. It's interesting. When I think back on all of the presentations that I've had here on this show, very few really talk about the impact of community. So thank you for bringing that up, because let's face it, how we are does impact those around us, and therefore will impact the community. Thank you.
You're welcome. Absolutely. I think that Nadine Burke-Harris, who is now the Surgeon General of the state of California, spoke about it best in her TED Talk that she gave on adverse childhood experiences, as well as her book called The Deepest Well, about how ACEs, as we refer to them, affect our community as a whole through the means of public health. For example, if you have a community that's embroiled in violence and poverty, they may not have access to the same types of things like therapy, counseling, parenting, safe places to go after school, and therefore there's a higher chance that they're going to be exposed to adverse experiences in the community within their homes. We also know that there's a direct link between domestic violence and incest, that where domestic violence happens, incest also happens to occur because the parents are so involved in their dysfunctional relationship that's probably often generationally taught them to be that way, that they don't have the ability to look after their children. And then you have not only a child that's grown up with domestic violence, now they also have sexual abuse and an unstable home environment. And we learn from public health records, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, as well as just the community in general. The poorer the community is, the more adverse childhood experiences they have, and the higher ACEs number you have, the higher chance you have of chronic illness and disease, which ultimately impacts the hospital and the ability to access care for ongoing issues.
That was a mouthful. A lot of stuff there to look at and think about. What was you going to say?
Definitely.
Yeah. Maybe is there some part of that you want to really kind of focus in on? Because there was a couple of things that triggered me, only because I'm big on parenting and its effects on children. But maybe you want to take a different tack on this, or
I'm happy to walk with you, Oli.
okay.
Let me know.
Okay, well, one of the things that you said, and it's one of the things that I've share with a lot of my clients and with colleagues, is the importance of role modeling, and you kind of touched on that in terms of parents doing the generational stuff where they just keep passing on bad parenting as if it's okay. It's like I said in one of my other episodes, I said, yeah, my father, when I confronted him with the upbringing, he said, I didn't know any better. Well, yeah, he doesn't go to parenting classes. He learned from his father, and his father learned from his father. And so it just sort of gets passed on. And that's kind of a shame. 30% of all abused children end up becoming abusive parents. And it just gets passed on. And I think what upsets me the most is the attitude of, well, if it was good enough for me, it's good enough for my kids.
I think that this is again back to the income and socioeconomic standing of the community. There's really not the access and resources to be able to provide that to parents. And it's absolutely generational. We know through epigenetics, which is the mutation of our DNA after being exposed to multiple adverse experiences, as well as things like slavery and racism and things like that that have been in our society for a very long time, that people are adversely impacted by that, which affects their ability to parent, as well as the idea that if there's parents and they're working 2 to 3 jobs just to support their household, the chance that they have to attend a class or attend a parenting course, if they're not so tired already from having to work just to support their family, because they may have less of an education, they themselves may have been a child of the foster care system, or they may have been a child coming from a home in which there was high ACEs there as well, that they don't have the opportunity to even get access to these types of programs, trainings, and systems of care because it doesn't exist in low socioeconomic communities. It's not advantageous for large corporations to provide services in a community where they don't get any access to the service. And there you have that chain, like you were describing, where my father didn't know and his father didn't know. As a child, I was spanked because my dad was hit with a belt. So somehow spanking was less. But what we know now is that hitting kids teaches kids to hit. It
Right.
creates aggression in them. And when we see children lashing out at other children, that's a learned behavior. So if a child is socialized in an environment that is aggressive or non-supportive or not compassionate or not nurturing, they don't have the opportunity to learn to be soft, and probably because their parents don't have the opportunity to give that to them. Conversely, where you see that there's multiple people that are very wealthy and have the opportunity to go to school and be educated, and their parents are both educated, we know that those are signs of success for children. Generally, most people have 1 or 2 ACEs in their life. And that could just be like my parents got divorced,
Yeah,
or
can I stop you there for a minute, April? And just for those who may not have seen the previous episode, can you explain the ACEs real quick?
sure. So ACEs is a series of 10 questions, and they are questions such as, were you ever slapped, hit, and beat, or abused physically in any way as a child? Did you experience violence in your community? Did you ever feel that you were not worth enough, that anyone had any time to pay attention to you? Did you experience trauma as a result of deportation, immigration, or a parent being incarcerated? Were you exposed in utero to drugs? Things like that, that when you think about these types of people, and when we're talking about the community of Santa Maria, I would probably guess that at least 50% of the population in Santa Maria has experienced some type of adverse childhood experience just by the nature of the socioeconomic status of the community.
Hmm. Yeah, and there was another thing I thought of as you were talking. Thank you for the explanation. The other thing I was talking about as you were talking about the generational lack of change, I'm going to say. Uh, the other thing is it seems to be, and correct me if I'm wrong from your experience, but it seems to be normalized by the culture or the society that the parents are in. I'll give you a really terrible example. I had a client who had a very difficult child and happened to get on a website that also had mothers of single mothers, again, single mothers, difficult children. And when she told me some of the things that they were suggesting and reinforcing in one another, I was appalled. And
Mhm.
I said, stop and listen to yourself. Is this what you really want to do to your child? I mean, I didn't make a judgment. I just asked her. And when she stopped and thought about it, she says, no, that's wrong. But you've got all these people out here who are supporting these negative ideas that somehow it's okay.
I think that that's definitely a big challenge within the community that we live in. And when we talk about communities at large within the United States, Santa Maria is actually quite a wealthy community compared to some with throughout the United States. There's the community in Appalachia that is been impoverished since as long as I could remember. And a great example of who came from there is Dolly Parton. And although she grew up very poor, and she has said that the reason why she looks the way that she did is she found the prettiest woman in town, and that was the town tramp. And that's who she modeled herself after. Yet she still dedicated her life to improving the lives of others. And so I think one of the things that we also have to talk about with ACEs is not just necessarily the trauma that children and people have experienced for generations, but the resiliency that comes from people who have, which studies have shown, at least one stable adult that's consistent in their life throughout their childhood. We know through attachment theory with John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth that they demonstrate the need for nurturing safe, stable relationships with a consistent caregiver throughout their life. And when that gets interrupted is when we start to develop problems like domestic violence and insecurity in relationships, substance abuse, which Dr. Gabor Mate talks about as a childhood substance abuse coming from a childhood deprivation rather than a dependence on the substance. So there's lots of data and research out there about how people experience these ACEs. We're just now starting to really look at resiliency of what makes people go one way or the other. How do people become successful? I myself, out of a score of 10, am a 7 out of 10 of ACEs. Pretty high.
Yeah, I managed to get a 4. Yeah, 7, that's pretty high, young lady. You had a difficult childhood, sounds like.
I definitely did. I am open to talking about it, but it's not necessarily about me. It's really about the collective experience as people on a whole, whether they're in Appalachia, whether they live on a native reservation, a Native American reservation, which we know that Native Americans are disproportionately represented in intimate partner violence, sexual abuse, kidnapping, and also within the foster care system, as well as fetal alcohol syndrome, which are all symptoms of adverse childhood experiences.
Yeah, I think that's what people don't get. It's this idea, I think, that people think when they're parenting, oh well, the kid will get over it. It's no big deal. No, it really is a big deal, and it does set them up. Again, as you're talking, I remember I was thinking about you and me, and you got a 7, I got a 4, and I remember sitting at a supervisor's training once, and there was about 5 of us sitting there. We all had very similar backgrounds, and I almost think it kind of drives us to get out there and say, hey folks, knock it off. You know, you're hurting children, and for the adult, let's see if we can undo some of the damage that's been done. And it's really amazing. You touched on something, and I would kind of like you to expand a little on that in terms of the things that childhood trauma causes later on in life, because I was kind of amazed at some of the problems that we can get later on in life, which have nothing necessarily to do with psychological issues.
Yeah, so one of the things that we really see is heart disease. Heart disease, congestive heart failure, coronary artery disease, and multiple other things that are a result of exposure to adverse childhood experiences. And I think the tendency is to be like, what? There's no connection there. It's impossible. But when you think about when a person is constantly under stress, our body constantly reduces adrenaline or produces adrenaline as well as cortisol. And cortisol, for those of us, just a basic understanding of the brain structure is that our hypothalamus and amygdala is about the size of a fingernail, an almond shaped fingernail. And it is the center where the amygdala and the hypothalamus work together as our threat detection system in our brain. And when our brains start to perceive so much threat all the time, like we're in constant chaos in our home, we're being abused, whatever the nature of the abuse is, and specifically to Santa Maria, which has the highest case of child welfare involvement in the county, it's pretty incredible how they really link up. So if our body is constantly producing cortisol and adrenaline, our heart has to work even harder to be able to regulate our nervous system. And our nervous system has already worked hard enough to just try to regulate us on a daily basis. We're talking about impulse control, behavior modification, critical thinking, problem solving. And then you sprinkle in a mother who used throughout their pregnancy, for whatever reason, meth or heroin, the baby is automatically born with a modified nervous system, likely to that of a frayed rope. So the child go into neonatal abstinence syndrome from birth, and then they produce their body is already producing these hormones. They have to be given multiple drugs when they're born to just to de-escalate them from not going into respiratory shock. Even if that doesn't happen, say that a person is just a child is living in a domestic violence home and they witness violence. It's very scary for the child. They don't understand. Their prefrontal cortex is not developed to be able to understand that, number one, it's not their fault, but number two, that how do they make it stop? And so their nervous system just for their entire life is just pumping them full of these hormones that are meant to control safety. When we see a bear, we want to run away. But when you live with a bear and your bear is your parents and they're constantly fighting, or someone's constantly sexually abusing you, which we know 1 in 3 girls is sexually abused and 1 in 5 boys is sexually abused, your body is always on alert. Fast forward about 20, 30 years, if you're not into a full-blown substance abuse addiction, then you're likely having some major health problems. And there's a lot of research to show that a lot of these autoimmune diseases and even some linkage for autism, folks that are experiencing these things, can be directly related back to trauma and the way the nervous system was regulated. And then we start to see things like coronary artery disease, congestive heart failure if they're smoking, which is a coping mechanism, or that people are injecting themselves with needles and that they've now subjected themselves to HIV and hepatitis C, which are chronic health conditions that there's no known cure for. So in fact, while it seems maybe initially superficial that, oh, okay, I maybe can understand it, we see direct linkages. And the more ACEs you have, anything over 4 grows exponentially up to where another person might have been. So say that you have 1 to 2 ACEs, maybe it grows like that much. And then you have like 3 to 4 and it grows that much. But then you start getting into like 4 and 5 and it's very big. And then 5 and 6. And before you know it, the difference between having 4 ACEs and 7 ACEs is really like a 120-story building. And imagine that your body has to be able to cope with that for your entire life.
Right. I'm glad you put it that way, because boy, very, very descriptive. Thank you so much, because I think people need to understand that what happens with and I'm just going to oversimplify it, What happens with the physical trauma to a child or to an adult is it releases chemicals, hormones in the body that damage the body. So
Mm-hmm.
even though, everybody's concerned about, oh, you don't want to show bruises on the body, there can be emotional trauma that can in fact elevate these same chemicals and hormones and cause the same amount of damage that any kind of physical trauma might happen. So, where you think you're just, oh, I don't hit my kid, but you're causing emotional trauma to the child, you're still damaging the child.
Absolutely. That's absolutely correct, Oli. And really what it is about access and equity of care. We cannot educate a population if we live in scarcity and we live in a very self-centered society where everyone is just struggling to make ends meet. And I'm not saying we have to be in a socialist model, but the idea that we help each other and we promote human kindness, compassion, not only to others, but also to ourselves, and that we extend grace to ourselves and others as well, where there's just no space for that in low socioeconomic status communities. It just doesn't exist when everyone is just fighting to survive. And then you have people like Jeff Bezos at the top of the structure, and they're going into space in a penis-shaped rocket, that it becomes difficult to see how we would ever achieve equity. And the people that need that equity give up because they don't have the opportunity, whether or not they even finish high school. And especially within Latino communities, there's a very big expectation that you go to work and you support your family. Many of the children in our local high schools, before they go to school in the morning, they work in the field for 3 or 4 hours while their parents are also working, or they have to get up at 4 in the morning and they take care of their siblings. And not only are we talking about exposure to traumatic events, but what food is offered within a community, which is why I say and echo the sentiment expressed by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris that this is a public health issue. You can live in a community where there is healthy grocery stores and there's access to food and all of that, healthy food, vegetables, fruits, things that we need to be able to have a healthy digestive system. And you go into a poor community and you have several liquor stores and they have cheap snacks like Cheetos and cookies and sugary drinks, and those automatically relate back to the body not getting the nutrients that it needs. And I think there's an easy way to just say from critics, oh, well, why don't they just buy healthier food? Well, because a bag of chips is $1 and a bag of spinach is $5, and
Right.
children like to eat spinach. If they know Cheetos, they want to eat Cheetos.
That's right.
I think where we best see this in our community, for those that are watching that know the Santa Barbara area and the Santa Barbara County area, it's the difference between Lompoc and Montecito. Montecito does not have school-based counselors because they said that they don't need them. No kids go to see them because their parents can afford to send them to a private therapist. The schools in Lompoc, on the other hand, they can't keep therapists there long enough to serve the community because everyone is using them as a jumping off place in their career. So that means that the children constantly have change in their mental health professional or clinician. Lompoc also has one grocery store right now that's feeding the entire population.
Wow.
While they're waiting for a new grocery store to come in, the community is actively being gentrified, where there's no more low income housing. It's very expensive to live there. Families are living in riverbeds because there's no space. And you go over to the community of Montecito that has several very high-end luxury hotels that are $700 to $800 per night, which is what people are paying for a room in Lompoc for a month. And the people that work at those hotels have to live in that community. Montecito has all of these beaches, they have all of these stores, there's all of this celebrity and wealth there. And so the property taxes provide all of these things and access to educational support services that children in Lompoc don't have because there isn't enough money funded through property taxes. All of these things are all intertwined, and it seems like this big, huge web of these things that ultimately are a part of adverse childhood experiences.
No, I hear you, and I hear you loud and clear, and I've echoed some of the similar sentiments myself. I mean, it's one thing to pass on from generation, but as I said earlier, in terms of the societal cultural values and things, also affects and normalizes that. And so, unfortunately, we develop this class system where, oh well, you're poor, that's tough. Go eat your Cheetos, and oh, you're rich. Well, go have your filet mignon. We don't tend to think of these as creating adverse effects on the children, but they most certainly do. I mean, I don't know. I remember when I was young, my father was a gardener. We didn't have a lot of money, and I went over to Baskin Robbins to get an ice cream one day. And I thought I had enough change, and I didn't. And this lovely woman, paid for my ice cream cone. It was somewhat embarrassing. I was about somewhere between 9, 10 years old, and it was like, God, I guess I'm poor, and it didn't feel good. And that's what I believe you're talking about is that effect on the child from the environment that we don't pay attention to.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And I had a similar experience also when I was growing up. Very poor. My parents got married way too young. They ultimately got divorced. So automatically that's already one ACE. My mother married multiple times. So that's inconsistent caregiving, which is another thing, another notch on the scoreboard. And not only that, but that she was so preoccupied by her relationships that she was unable to care for us, that our dad was given primary custody, which in the state of California almost never happens.
True.
And that's another notch, inconsistent caregiving and parent not available. And I started to really internalize, well, this must be me, because in the middle of all of that, I experienced sexual abuse, exposure to drug use, domestic violence, unstable home, exposure to just pretty much everything and anything in the book. I've even been kidnapped as a child.
Good Lord.
So somehow, through who knows what, I was able to get on the other side of things, a consistent parent in my father, that I was able to come through to the other side. Yes, so my sister and I are the only two in our family who have master's degrees. And I'm working in the field of social work, which now, after I've done my own therapy and my own work with myself, it's no surprise that I'm a social worker.
Of course. Bless your heart. Well, I hate to bring this to a close, but I'm afraid our time has run out, and I want to thank you so much. You have an impressive amount of knowledge under your belt there, young lady, and I'm glad that you were able to share that all with us. So thank you so much, April, for coming on and talking with us and sharing with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Oli. I appreciate that.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of The Therapy Corner. We had an opportunity to spend some time with April Wilson, who is an associate clinical social worker, and she just elaborated really well on some of the aspects of ACEs and childhood trauma. So for those of you out there who've experienced it, please seek help. Help is available. For the rest of you who seem to be okay, enjoy and have a good day. Take care.